So I assume, unless you've been living under a rock, and most people on the internet, and certainly my subscribers, do not live under a rock, you're well aware of what happened recently in New Zealand. Very, very recently. This mass shooting of a mosque. 49 people killed, as of now, to the best of my knowledge. Several others injured. And needless to say, it should be stated at the outset, I do not condone this violence. What the gentleman did was absolutely horrific, and I certainly do not approve of what he did. But beyond that, I want to talk about primarily implications of what happened here. Now, it's well known, based on his manifesto and statements that he made, that he was a sort of accelerationist, meaning he was looking to push the envelope forward in order to stir the fires of conflict. That is the accelerationist view in these extreme circles. But it actually is long-term counterproductive on so many different fronts. So yes, this will lead to more conflict, which is what he wanted and what he stated in his manifesto, that he wanted more conflict between various people. And we know the sorts of people that he wanted conflict between. But that's actually not how it's going to go down long term. When things like this happen, the right, and anybody who is not far left, or anybody who does not fall within the normal camp of normie rhetoric about virtually any subject, not just this, whenever this happens, there's always a clampdown on dissonant voices and voices that differentiate themselves from the normative voices you hear in the media. Again, I do not condone what happened, make that clear. But if people have different views of the world, whether it's about immigration or sex differences, or take your pick, yeah, you are going to be affected by this indirectly because you are going to be seen as part of this giant blob of quote-unquote far-right extremism. As you know, for a while my channel was demonetized. You know, I've had constant accusations of being far-right and being extreme, even though, intentionally or not, I'm pretty milquetoast, I think, overall. And that might be boring, but hey, it is what it is. But everything gets lumped into this gigantic blob of the right. And I certainly have to make the concession that, generally speaking, the people I have conversations with typically are on the right, because the left these days is so closed off to any sort of conversation and any sort of reasonable interaction that it's just not an option. I'm a centrist at the end of the day. I have some viewpoints that would fall much more on the left and some viewpoints that would fall much more on the right. It really depends on the issue. But inasmuch as my associations go, the people I talk to tend to be on the right. And that's just a consequence of the reality we live in, the political climate, where the left is just hopeless. I've made this point before in a video where I talk about giving them inches and they take leagues. They're completely unreasonable. They don't want a balanced world where they get their piece of the pie and other people get their piece of the pie. They want everything. And so, de facto, even though I'm definitely not right, I repeat, I am not right-wing, I am thrown into the camp. Other people are thrown in the camp. Even if you're just right of center or somewhat conservative, you will be thrown in the camp. And that whole process will be accelerated, no pun intended, by the events in New Zealand. It won't just be New Zealand that's affected. Wherever you are, presumably you're in the West, you will be affected by this indirectly if you want to speak of certain things, if you have different views. So in that sense, there will be blowback. And I don't see how that's a positive thing, because given the overwhelming influence of left and far left politics in today's world and current discourse, how is being shut out of that a good thing? How is being excluded from platforms beneficial long term? It might lead to more violence, which is what this gentleman wanted, as stated in his manifesto, but that's not going to change people's minds. Quite the opposite. And that's the problem here. When people do things like this, or the shooting on the synagogue in Pennsylvania a while back, the reaction is to clamp down more, to draw the so-called political borders even more tightly, to make sure nobody comes in, and to bunker down in your own camp. Each side bunkers down in its own camp, and they do it all the more enthusiastically as a consequence. So the words, and reasonable words above all, that could have reached more people sometime down the future with different political perspectives or different views on certain hot topics like immigration, they will be increasingly suppressed, and the narrative will become ever more one-sided, as if it weren't one-sided enough already, but you see what I mean. It will become even more so, because it can become even more so, and in particular the rhetoric the gentleman engaged in his manifesto. So this is not a good thing for anybody who is not far left, put it that way. I'd argue it's not even good for people left of center, like Sam Harris. I'll give you an example. Sam Harris now, and as you probably know, there's things about Sam Harris I like and some things I don't. Irrespective, Sam Harris now is being accused of being quote-unquote responsible for the shootings in New Zealand, which is bizarre. He's very critical of Islam, understandably. So am I. I make no secret of the reality that I don't like Islam, and I don't think it's particularly conducive to a healthy society. But hey, that's my view, and that's neither here nor there. But Sam Harris is suddenly responsible for the shooting of this sort. It's absolutely insane, and he's left of center, by the way. Even, you could say, traditionally liberal in a 90s sense, sort of a 90s liberal type of guy. So nobody benefits from that in terms of the discourse, what people are allowed to say, how they're allowed to interact with each other. I would say that's the primary element here of how we all lost out due to this event in New Zealand. The other element is simply retaliatory attacks, which are quite plausible and dangerous. And yes, that's what the gentleman in question wanted to occur. He wanted this to happen. He wanted retaliation, violent conflict. And how is that going to help anything? Because here's the thing. Ideally, he wants some sort of war-type scenario. That's very, very unlikely. Instead, what's far more likely will be sporadic episodes of violence, pockets of it here and there. And yes, that's what he wanted, but this won't achieve anything. This will just achieve more violence and more death. Totally banal goal that gets us nowhere. Whatever people's views might be, generally speaking, you have to sway the hearts and minds of people through words, rhetoric. Engaging in these types of actions, historically even, they haven't led anywhere good. Think about the assassination that preceded World War I. Think about the execution of the Romanov family in the early 20th century. None of these things, not a single one of these things, led to anything good. They led to destruction, war, a restructuring of society in some cases, and you could say it is what it is, but very little of it was good. And so if you just look at the historical track record of these types of events, it's just not beneficial. And I'm not sure if I have that much more to say on this. And those two key elements, the fact primarily that anyone with any sort of view or opinion that differs from the mainstream will now be relentlessly drummed out by the din of the mainstream and active measures to do so, and a reignition of the type of conflict that we typically see in Islamic terrorist attacks. None of this is beneficial. Absolutely none of it. Because as a final point, we all know that the mainstream is actively looking to clamp down on voices that differ from theirs. And they're always looking for a good reason to do so. And this is probably the best reason, bar none, the quote-unquote justification they can offer. Look what happened. This guy, this shooter, he was a caricature of the current internet generation. 4chan, poll, memes, references to PewDiePie, and he went around and assassinated a bunch of people in a mosque. It's bizarre. It's eerie. There's something somewhat grotesque about it. And, of course, people are going to make these associations. I can assure you, if you're on the right, which I am not, again, but if you're on the right, whatever your flavor, even if you're an ethno-nationalist, which, again, I am not, this will not work in your favor. And so I think condemnation of this is important, one, if only because of the methodology, counterproductive to even obscurely unrelated topics like talking about sex differences. Because it's all part of the rhetoric with the mainstream that certain topics, even if backed up by well-founded evidence, should not be brought to bear or discussed because it just doesn't fit the current narrative and the narrative that they want to propagate. Nothing good will come of this. Nothing. Anyway, that's all I have to say about this. More to come, I hope, if I'm still alive. I got some interesting video topics coming up, far more interesting than this one. Nonetheless, thank you for checking it out. And as always, may the gods watch over you. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.